This video is sponsored by the International Society for Primal People. Bigfoot of the Blues, Chapter 4. The fascinating Chief Bigfoot story, or legend, of southwest Idaho. What would you do if you captured a Bigfoot? Should this be done? Bigfoot means many things to many people. The range is all the way from it's real to it's not, and the fringe who place it in between. That's an area we'll deal with later on. Admittedly, this area is one with few believers, but some nevertheless. And then, on the other hand, it is a highly fascinating, if seemingly to most, as what's somewhat unreal region, yet truly a facet of the Bigfoot story. We will also explore the beliefs of people other than Grover Krantz in just what this creature is all about. Krantz will be heard from again because this man does have so much to offer on the subject. Findings of others will be given mention, for there have been, and are today, a host of people, men and women alike, out in the field, investigating every possible lead to locating a Bigfoot. From the time I wrote my first story about Bigfoot of the Blues, I have accumulated reactions. Often, when a new story angle was printed in the Walla Walla Union Bulletin, and then in these later years the Waitsburg Times, friends would accost me on the street to challenge or to share the hallowed words of this aficionado. And sometimes a friend would see my latest story on Bigfoot, then would pen his own feelings about the subject. My favorite of these was that done by the well-known Western author Bill Gulick, who made his home in Walla Walla. Bill was also the first to challenge the emerging story in the blues. His letter came to me days after my first story appeared in the Union Bulletin. In 1966, I'd reported a motorcyclist story about seeing some big tracks on the lonely Mill Creek Road. Gulick needed little introduction about the United States as well as many other parts of this globe. His most recent writing effort was the excellent Oregon reference Roadside History of Oregon. His novels, some made into movies, and other books about the West are popular to many. I think you'll enjoy his letter, with this highly interesting character leaping right out of the pages of our Northwest history and legends. Gulick's letter follows. I have been intrigued to hear that my old friend Bigfoot is now making tracks in our area. Lest some of your readers note that this legendary giant plays a prominent role in my recently published novel, They Came to a Valley, and accuse me of concocting a publicity stunt, I merely state that his tracks are his own responsibility, not mine. While doing research at the Idaho Historical Society during the past 6 years, I became intrigued with the Bigfoot legend, and out of curiosity, followed up every lead in an effort to ascertain whether this tale was fact or fancy. Here is what I discovered. First reference to Chief Bigfoot, as the early settlers of southwestern Idaho Territory called him, appeared in 1862, when an expedition of citizen volunteers out Indian hunting claimed that they came across his tracks on the banks of the Snake River. The tracks measured 17.5 inches in length by 6 inches in width. Between 1862 and 1868, a dozen or so references appeared in the newspapers of the area regarding Chief Bigfoot. Invariably, they were secondhand. Somebody had seen somebody who had seen him. He was alleged to be a part white, part Indian renegade who had become a leader of all the hostiles in that part of the country and was waging a war of extermination against the whites. After 1868, he is heard of no more. By odd coincidence, 1868 marked the end of the Indian troubles in that part of the country. For General George Crook, after a long and grueling campaign, had exterminated, starved, or frozen out those savages who chose to resist and forced the rest to go on to reservations. Chief Bigfoot was reliably reported to have been killed and carried off by friends at least a half a dozen times during the campaign, but I have found no first-hand account by any person that ever saw him. He was known by many names: Ulux, Weaweha, Nampu, all of which appear to be different Indian dialects meaning Bigfoot. The town of Nampa, Idaho, seems to have been named for him. In 1878, some 10 years after General Crook had pacified the hostile Indians of southwestern Idaho, eastern Oregon, and northern Nevada, a long article was published in the Boise, Idaho Statesman entitled Bigfoot's Last Stand. It was authored by one William T. Anderson, who claimed to have been an eyewitness to an epic duel between a white gunman named John Wheeler and Chief Bigfoot. The duel was supposed to have taken place in a canyon since known as Bigfoot Canyon, just south of the Snake River on the stage road between Nampa and Silver City. The eyewitness claimed that John Wheeler put 17 bullets from a Henry rifle into the monster's body before finally bringing him down. Even then, such was the vitality of Chief Bigfoot, he was able to down a pint of whiskey and then, as he lay dying, dictate a full confession so lengthy that it had to be published in several installments in the Statesman. Later, it was picked up and reprinted in eastern papers such as the St. Louis Globe-Democrat. Readers interested in this curious document may find it on pages 145 to 160 in a book called Heroes and Heroic Deeds of the Pacific Northwest by Henry L. Talkington, Caxton Press, 1929. The eyewitness, who fortunately had a tape measure with him, recorded Bigfoot's height as 6'8" and his foot at 18 inches or so in length, and estimated his weight to be over 300 pounds. Bigfoot claimed his real name was Star Wilkinson, and that he was related to the famous outlaw families of that name back in Oklahoma and Missouri. How a man with 17 bullet holes in his body could even hold a pint of whiskey, let alone live long enough to make such a lengthy confession, are facts not explained by the author. Also not explained is the 10-year lapse between the battle, July 1868, and the eyewitness account published in the Statesman. But a number of people seem to have accepted it true at the time. As a matter of fact, even today on the north shore of Snake River on Idaho State Highway 45, a local pioneer society has erected a sign, Bigfoot's Last Fight, which immortalizes the alleged duel between the giant Indian and the gunman John Wheeler. Far be it from me to question the credulity of local pioneer societies. To me, this is a legend, and an interesting one, and in my recent novel, I have accepted it as part of the regional lore. As a matter of fact, almost all western communities have legends of giant Indians, giant lake serpents, etc., as do distant lands, such as the Himalayas with their abominable snowman. Dr. Merle Wells, archivist for the Idaho Historical Society, tells me that, in his opinion, 99% of the Bigfoot story is fancy, though there is perhaps 1% evidence that at one time or another a tremendously big Indian did exist in Idaho territory. As to the supposed eyewitness account by William Anderson, this obviously was concocted by a newspaper writer with nothing to do on a rainy day. And, as fellow writers, you and I can only hope that he was paid properly for his efforts. I do know it to be a fact that on several occasions during the late 1860s, teenage youngsters improvised gigantic moccasins, made big footprints, cut clotheslines, robbed watermelon patches, and tipped over outhouses, hoping that the blame would be placed on Chief Bigfoot. But of course, youngsters do not pull such pranks today. Needless to say, I treasure this letter from longtime friend and fellow writer Bill Gulick. For several years during my 20-year assignment as a Union Bulletin's roving reporter, it was my good fortune to share several trips into the fabulous John Day country of eastern Oregon. Hosting these 3- and 4-day auto rides was a former resident of the John Day area, retired school teacher, newspaper columnist, and poet W.S. Caverhill. He was a master of the short, punchy commentary style, a befitting and even equaling Will Rogers' one-time newspaper column. 4 years after the Mill Creek sighting and Gulick's letter, I reported a sighting of a Bigfoot in the vicinity of Tiger Canyon, east of Walla Walla. Caverhill put me and the report in my/its place with this paragraph in the Milton Freewater, Oregon Valley Herald. Bigfoot again. A recent article in the Walla Walla Bulletin by Vance Orchard, in which he claims that he and a chum of his saw something or heard something, or thought they did, in Tiger Canyon that was Bigfoot. No soap, Vance. It has been previously established that Bigfoot has taken up residence in the Strawberry Wilderness area and is getting his mail at Van, Oregon. There is no point in throwing a scare into the people of the Walla Walla Valley by locating the beast in Tiger Canyon. Ron Carlson spins one. A tongue-in-cheek tale to match the size of a Bigfoot's foot came from his facile mind. Carlson, of course, needs no introduction in the Blue Mountains region. For several years now, he has been entertaining and educating residents with his photographic skills and occasionally the printed word. While a photographer by trade, Carlson has demonstrated more than once his equal artistry with word weaving. Those skills came out when he sat down to his word processor one day, following my reporting of the finding of miles of Bigfoot tracks coming out of the Blue Mountains in January 1991. The reader is hereby advised to use ample salt over the shoulder in reading of what he wrote, which began this way. Inspired by Vance Orchard's recent story in the Times about Bigfoot, I decided to put the issue at rest. Hike into the blues, find this shy, elusive giant, interview him or her, and break the story in the Times. I realize such action may seem bold, audacious, even dangerous to some of you readers, but then that's the way we journalists are. The story, the photo, the facts, and the unvarnished truth are what we're after, and we don't accept substitutes. Well, Carlson has set the tone in those two graphs, and having done so, he decides he'll do something with his upcoming weekend of rest following the grind of getting the Times to bed for another week. He considered doing nothing, but then the Bigfoot issue came to mind. But the thought of Vance Orchard's story with the exclusive Bigfoot came to mind, and I decided to do something to uncover its mystery. It occurred to me that an interview with Bigfoot would be just the thing to clear the air, render a public service, deliver a fast-breaking story for next week's edition of the Times, and grab a Pulitzer Prize to boot. Wow, what an agenda. Anyway, armed with a bag of cameras, map, protractor, and a pencil, our hero soon found himself in an isolated corner of the blues, on the headwaters of Whiskey Creek, at something known, by him at least, as Babbling Falls, something Carlson admitted to being, quote, a deliberate and even premeditated choice on my part. You see, I figure it this way. Vance Orchard, West and Swede Summerlin, Paul Freeman, et al. Have got this real passion to find Bigfoot, solve the mystery of all those muddy tracks, and bring Bigfoot into the public eye. I don't fault them for their interest and curiosity, but I'm convinced they're going about it the wrong way, end quote. No, Carlson's reasoning went, don't go chasing around, just sit yourself down at a campfire, put a bit of music on the tape recorder, and wait. Wow, why didn't we, all of the above that is, think of that? Carlson's wait was short, he writes. I didn't have long to wait either. I had just poured myself a cup of brew, cracked the cover of Best Loved Poems from Whiskey Creek, when I heard splashing water up the canyon. In a short time, this barefooted but elegant-looking creature came into camp. He sniffed the fresh coffee and asked politely, European roast? I nodded and poured him a cup and invited him to sit down. Carlson notes that his woodsy visitor was silent for a time, then indicated his knowledge of and enjoyment of Carlson's tape music. The story continues. Although I was pretty sure who this visitor was, I decided formalities were in order, and I introduced myself and then asked his name. I'm Bigfoot, he said softly, with a dead man's Peak accent. Percival J. Bigfoot III. You've probably heard of me. I've been in all the papers. Most of it has been misinformation, but I have generated a lot of ink. Almost as much as Joe Montana and Saddam Hussein. But it's mostly hearsay, rumor, and wild gossip. Actually, no one, until now, has ever seen me. I wouldn't allow it. I don't take kindly to being chased, but I could see by the creature-friendly environment you've created here that you weren't like most of them. I decided to come by and check you out. Carlson wrote that he and Bigfoot, who preferred to be called Percy, exchanged conversation for 2 hours on a wide range of subjects. Knowing Carlson, I can believe that part of the story. Carlson claims to have learned a lot about his campfire guest. But, as with all good things, this unusual confab had to end. Carlson's tale continues. We talked and began to experience that good rapport which springs up between two souls traveling in the same direction, if not the same road. But at moonrise, Percy said he had to go. The family was waiting, and tomorrow's began a long skiing weekend up on Dead Man's Peak with relatives and friends. I'd ask you to join us, he said, but not just yet. I want to tell the family about you first. Point out that you're not one of those mad dog reporters who will do anything for a story, even sell a soul for a Pulitzer Prize. We'll get together again, you know how, and we'll get better acquainted. And you'll get to see and understand why the Bigfoot tribe doesn't enter into your so-called civilization. Maybe you can write it in the Times, and others will begin to understand too. That would be good for all of us. Hey, you're getting some of the meat on the bones of this Carlson caper, but let the story unwind and conclude. And so, although I started out to get a scoop, a fast, breaking story, a Pulitzer Prize, I got instead some correction, a better understanding of the Bigfoot phenomenon, and the promise of further insights into their lives and philosophical views. Before we parted, I asked Percy if it would be okay to write a story about our meeting. Naturally, I didn't want this story to spoil their skiing weekend by sending hordes of the curious up to Dead Man's Peak. Percy told me to go ahead and write it, that it wouldn't make any difference to their weekend plans. Even if an army invaded the mountain, he said, they wouldn't find us. All they would see is tracks, and it would further confuse them. You see, there are other dimensions of life as yet undiscovered by your race. You see again, I didn't take any photos to go with this story, reader, but I'm sure you can see why. Souls like Percy Bigfoot III can't be caught on film or any other way. Yes, friends have had a field day with their tongue-in-cheek, but Chief Bigfoot surely got around the Pacific Northwest, judging from the accounts accumulated over many years, before and since the demise of the desert of the huge Juntotan Indian. The sightings and increasing credibility of the Big Chief in the form of a walking hairy Bigfoot add to the interesting spice to this chapter. The problem of what to do with a Bigfoot if one was to be captured has long been one of the most interesting facets to their story. The Bambi or Disney syndrome has even been given the creature in the movie Harry and the Hendersons. And the state of Washington, in observing its centennial in 1989, even adopted the Bigfoot as its official mascot for the year. Furthermore, this '89 mascot was given a name, Harrison, in honor of Benjamin Harrison, who was President of the U.S. when Washington became a state. At this time, two persons, one in Walla Walla and the other is what was then the Soviet Union, shared some similar ideas on what should be done securing a Bigfoot. The late Dick Bradford of Walla Walla was one Russian scientist, Marie Jane Kaufman was the other. Here's the story I did on the Union Bulletin in 1988. Dick Bradford, Route 2, has been at the trapping business around here since he was a youngster, so brings to his proposal no small background of knowledge should such an expedition get off the ground. Bradford doesn't come into the game with scant knowledge of the subject of the project either. Lots of people don't believe in Bigfoot, and I was one of them for a long time, Bradford says. I researched the subject for 35 years, and I'm convinced there is such a thing. Further, Bradford says he is convinced the time is at hand when we should try for one of these things. We shouldn't pass up an opportunity to capture this critter. Only 35 miles or so from downtown Walla Walla. Bradford also says his 3 decades of research had convinced him the Bigfoot is a prehistoric cave dweller, and the nearby Blue Mountains have plenty of caves in them, and many are in the watershed, the likely headquarters of the critter. If Bradford's plan is followed, there would be no shooting of a Bigfoot, and furthermore, any Bigfoot cage would be displayed right up there in the mountains, he adds. Then, when science has taken its samplings and other testings, etc., then the thing should be released right where it was found. For many years of trapping and bringing some wily animals down, such as a coyote, one of the most difficult, comes out as Bradford notes. I think the Bigfoot thing can be trapped, and if there is one of them up there, it can be captured. Bradford is fully aware that such an expedition would not be without peril and would also be quite costly to underwrite. But think of the publicity and the people who would want to come here for a close look at this thing. It would be in popular demand all over the world. We should make the attempt to be the first in the world to capture one and answer a lot of questions in the mind of scientists and lay people alike. Yes, the subject of our state's centennial mascot is on the minds of several scientists, for that matter, being given a lot of serious consideration. Perusal of a recent issue of the ISC newsletter, publication of the International Society of the Cryptozoology, reveals interesting opinions of a Russian scientist. She is Marie Jean Kaufman, considered the leading field investigator of the Soviet version of Bigfoot, the Elemus wildman. Kaufman was interviewed by newsletter editor J. Richard Greenwell. Her remarks concerning the possible capture of a Bigfoot, Almas, Sasquatch, etc., especially interesting. Greenwell asked Kaufman's thoughts on the subject of the discovery of such a creature. "I think that the impact will be enormous," she responded. "It will open new horizons to old dogmas in anthropology, medicine, psychology, sociology, and other disciplines. It will perhaps answer most of the questions that we have asked ourselves about our origin." Kaufman said she meant this in a philosophical, moral, and physical senses. One of the most fascinating aspects is the interpretation that Homo sapiens gives of this wild double of himself, about which he is always known in some way. Asked for elaboration on this statement, Kaufman replied, "This double, who is a kind of shadow of man, he has been watching man, always has, from the depths of the forest. This double is like a caricature of man, no longer as an animal, but not quite human. And what would be the moral implications if we were to capture some of these, in terms of their human rights?" Greenwell asked. "Would they be treated more like an aboriginal or native peoples in need of protection as human beings? Because of the close evolutionary relationship between us, they should be treated as humans," asserts Kaufman. However, the concept of treatment as an equal is not necessarily a fortunate one, since we treat fellow humans as equals in ways which are not always very benevolent. We who are doing research on these wild men hope from the deepest parts of our hearts that if they are discovered, they will not be treated like chimpanzees and other laboratory animals. Listening to Walla Walla's Dick Bradford and reading the opinions of Moscow's Marie Jean Kaufman, it becomes apparent that here are two people a half a globe apart, but each with similar thoughts on a similar anomaly. As this book is being written, mid-1992, Dr. Kaufman is one of the leaders mounting a massive, highly scientific search for the Elemus in her native land. Dick Bradford is as no stranger to readers of the Union Bulletin. When his proposal above made the media, the following story is as one I had earlier done on the man, his trapping background, including why he finally gave up this activity, and his Bigfoot encounters. Dick Bradford was 12 when he ran his first trap line for muskrats near the Umapine, a tiny farming community west of Walla Walla. 7 years ago, and 55 years later, Bradford hung up his tracks for good, vowing never again to trap or kill another animal. That came the same day he had to shoot the finest specimen of a coyote he had ever seen, an animal he had become skilled at trapping because he had learned to think just like one. Knowing the habits down to the most minute detail of the animal's hour-by-hour lifestyle is what constitutes a successful trapper, Bradford learned early. That was back in the 1920s when he started. Times were tough and money was not easy to come by, especially for a 12-year-old, he recalls. It was 35 below that winter too, he notes. When I finally caught my first one, I thought I had done something. I caught 8 that first winter and did well at $1 a pelt. That doesn't sound like much, but in those days, that was a hell of a lot of money, especially when you might only make $1 a day working, if you got to work. Bradford did get work. He was a truck driver most of his life, but he continued trapping almost every season for some 35 years until one day he found the big coyote in one of his traps on Lewis Peak. And some seasons he made more money off his trap lines than he did his regular job, he says. How about this matter of thinking like an animal to catch one? Bradford doesn't go into details of how he learned the ways of the wily coyote, but he does explain partially. When I first started trapping coyotes, I trapped all fall and never caught one. So I went out north of Walla Walla and set some traps. When I got way back and out of sight and studied every move by the coyotes using my binoculars, I learned a whale of a lot about coyotes that winter. When I started trapping the next season, I caught a whale lot of them with no effort whatsoever. A government trapper pulled out when the animals petered out. I learned more about coyotes than would ever be found in a book. Bradford said he was all but living with them. But if you're going to make a living at trapping, you must learn this. While most of Bradford's trapping experience had been in the valley and the Blue Mountains foothills, he had run a line in the Lewis Peak area of the Blue Mountains. It was here that he trapped the big coyote and where he ended his trapping of wild animals. It is in the mountains especially that one must study all details of terrain as well as the animal's habits and habitat. Bradford says, if you're going to be a successful trapper, you must study the mountains. You must notice everything and not overlook a thing. The way the grass is bent, a tree limb snapped off here and there. Read that sign and you can trap. Bradford says the coyote trapped on Lewis Peak was the biggest, most beautiful I ever saw. Apparently he was the leader of a sizable pack of coyotes, too, judging by the many tracks trampling down the snow all around him. And he knew when I came upon him that I was going to shoot him. He set up a peculiar whining and howling, almost as if he was begging me to spare his life. I would have given $200 if I could have turned him loose, but I couldn't. An ordinary coyote, in the mountains especially, will weigh around 22 to 25 pounds. This one went 50 pounds. And so, despite the challenge present in trapping coyotes, Bradford ended his trapping when he bagged that king of the mountain. I have always liked a challenge, Bradford says, and the coyote is one of the smartest animals we know, and he has a nose that won't quit. He can pick up a scent more than a mile away. Bradford, now retired from trucking and trapping alike, has been turning his talents to other elusive Blue Mountains wildlife species, Bigfoot or Sasquatch, as it is known in British Columbia. Several people claim to have seen Bigfoot, and more than one, in the Blues, Bradford says. The most celebrated 1982 sighting here by U.S. Forest Service watershed patrol rider Paul Freeman is not the first incident, Bradford says. My family research goes back 30 to 40 years, and we have been researching and cataloging material about it. And we have been researching and cataloging material about it, he says. However, although he and his wife years ago had what each feels was a near close encounter, they have yet to see one. I've never seen one, but everyone who tells me they have seen one said that it's the most unusual thing of their life. Even the experience he and his wife had while he was picking up raccoon tracks on Mill Creek was the weirdest feeling of my life. I hope I never experience it again, he says. His wife echoes the statement, it is just a feeling, a sensation that something was nearby. I can't explain it, he says. And 2 days before that, also on Mill Creek, Bradford says he came back to a big boulder to which he'd wired a trap to find the boulder, 4 feet in diameter, had been moved 30 feet away. It apparently had been picked up by something and heaved to one side, so there was no dragging marks, Bradford recalls. Bradford is gathering more material and talking to people like Freeman and Weston Swede Summerlin as he seeks to become acquainted with the pattern of lifestyle of the Bigfoot. It is the same as when he was learning about coyotes, he says. It's the same for Bigfoot. Not only must you learn all about him, but you must outthink him in order to find him, the ex-trapper says. Bradford is pitting his longtime skills as a trapper to the catching of a Bigfoot, using the same techniques he learned in a half-century of trapping muskrats, raccoons, and coyotes. He is also confident the evasive, mysterious Sasquatch will be found this year. If not through his own efforts, then by somebody. I'll make a prediction, he says. Someone will get a Bigfoot this year on film or dead to prove its existence one way or the other. Getting other proof on film won't be easy, because the film shot by Roger Patterson in 1967 has had a lot of pros and cons. End of chapter 4.